Let's start with gaming. No, what do you say?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, gaming is the thing to talk about.
All right. Is it possible for you to give us a little bit of an overview of, like, if I like, I'm trying to think of the first gaming company in India. Like, I don't know, man. Like, my gaming knowledge is very bad. So, like, what do you think was like the, uh, like, in according to you, like, where do you think the gaming industry began in India? Whatever, how you think about it. I don't know.
I think bit tricky one, but I'm sure the history actually goes more behind than what most people would normally assume. I would if I were to point, I would say that it probably began in the 80s when the traveling businessmen in Delhi were going to US and markets in China and discovered that there are these home consoles like Nintendo and Atari, which were selling like hotcakes in a lot of those markets, and realized that there is a clear commercial opportunity there. So what ended up happening was a lot of these people end up buying these copies of these home hill consoles and these games, and they started bringing them to markets like Lajpat Nagar in Delhi. And very interestingly, the very first enterprising activity in gaming probably began by just reworking some of those assets which were made in these markets, and then trying to sell them in these secondary gray markets like Lajpat Nagar. uh, Quite interesting, and I believe that it went on well all the way into the early 2000s. But that was a quite a decent commercial activity, with tons of games within a year and a half of their release making their way into these markets, and then generally from Delhi, these games sort of got dispersed into various parts of the country. The earliest gamers also, I think, by definition, becomes the slightly middle class, higher upper middle class folks who generally can afford these sort of devices back in the day when we were barely able to use color televisions. But the market itself definitely did exist from that days, right? And unfortunately, it
Do you
was
have
not.
any? Do you have any idea about the cost of those consoles?
Tough to say at this point in time, but if I just go by the rule of thumb that I had personally observed in 2015, 16, it would probably be selling at one sixth or one tenth of the original cost that it would have sold in markets like Japan, because we were quite good at reworking the more costlier aspects of things like the consoles themselves. So there are two aspects to it, right? One is the hardware on which the game itself is played, which is generally your handheld consoles, or in the later cases, these PlayStations and Xboxes. And the second is the gaming content in itself, right? And both, for you to be a true pirate, I guess you'd need to sort of break it on both sides, right? But the good thing is you only have to sell your hardware once, and once you have a hardware, you could potentially play a large number of games in them. For example, one PlayStation could easily get you through 200, 300 games. So that was a slightly easier one to sell, even though it had a higher friction to sort of like get into the market. The gaming disc market and the gaming content market was far easily pirated, because in the earlier days, digital rights management was not really a thing, and anti-piracy technology was also not very sophisticated. So it was as easy as sort of ripping off the gaming content in one form factor, which could be video cassette or a DVD, onto pirated version at barely any cost, and you generally would be able to buy them at 50 to 100 bucks. And this went on for a substantial period of time, and I'm sure that a lot of people in my generation, and I'm sure your generation as well, probably started by playing just pirated games, right? I think my earliest memories of playing games was a pirated copy of Need for Speed, released in 1999. Uh, Absolutely pirated for sure. Bought it for probably 40, 50 rupees. Bought it from a railway station somewhere. You sort of insert the disc, hope that it doesn't sort of break your system. You create an offline copy of that game, and then you're good to start playing, right? So I think that wave of content really being disseminated through these console based ripoffs also actually transcended well into the PC era of the early 2000s, which is where a lot of the current younger generation really started getting into gaming, right? And I think that's a good one to really marinate a bit about, because when you traditionally think of the Indian gaming consumers, a lot of time we have this conception that they've only been mobile native, right? While that's true for a large degree of the population, for the largest 700 odd million people, there is still a 10 to 50 million people who have actually played these global quality games, albeit pirated, for a very long amount of time, and have built affinity, right? So if you look at the brand recall of brands like Rockstar or even Dota or League of Legends, it's very hard to explain why that's the case. And the real reason is the rich context and background that we have of really consuming content in these fashion.
Did we the way I'm thinking about this is like what I want to understand is when the internet came. I mean, when it feels like companies like Amazon and let's say um, browsers, maybe Netscape per se, or other. Generally what happens is companies get started in the US, and maybe the knockoffs, or by the time they come to India, like I think one good example is like even Amazon, right? Like Amazon I think started in 94 in the US, and then I think it came 2014 in India. Took them like 2 decades to maybe get there. Even the rip off technology like Flipkart, I think it started in '08 or '07. Even I think took them more than a decade. What I'm trying to understand is like did India come to the gaming landscape also much later than, was it like one or two generations um, behind Western countries? Or was there like, when, let's say they were playing Need for Speed X in the US and Japan maybe, or in Western countries,
Yeah.
in India, they were playing maybe one version below that, or, they were still,
Yeah.
how was that landscape there?
It's tough to say, but if you really think about when the gaming industry really took off globally, or when it started becoming a commercially meaningful enterprise, I would probably say it happened in the early 60s, right? Early on, it started as a project by scientists sitting in defense laboratories in the 1960s in the US. But by 70s, it was actually a meaningful enough business across the Western markets. Even in markets like Japan and South Korea, gaming was actually becoming a meaningful enough business, right? So if you look at the market maturity perspective, the gaming industry was mature in these markets by 1980s, early 1980s in these markets, whereas in India, we were far away from there, right? Because it is ultimately a consumer experience business that gaming is, and it requires for you to have a basic level of infrastructure, right? You need access to internet, you need access to a computing device with a reasonable degree of compute power. You need access to memory and storage, and those were things which are of extremely short supply for Indian consumers back in the 90s and 2010s. I think the real shift happened when really a lot of this consumer electronic technology started becoming more commonplace in India post the 1990s liberalization, and a lot of that tech started coming in. And then slowly that parity gap started dropping from 3 or 4 decades to 5 years, 15 years. And then at this point of time, now we are getting very, very close to almost having content parity, at least on platforms like mobile, right? Now, pretty much what India plays is what the global audience plays, at least on mobile. In the console market, for the people who already own consoles and play them, which is a non-trivial percentage of population, they are also continuing to play the globally competitive games which are released the previous year. So I think that that still sort of exists, but now we are very well past that point where we are playing games which are almost like a generation away.